Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. In this video, I'm going to talk about the gerrymandering of electorates and the malapportionment of the electorates. And it's really important to understand that they're two different things and they occur for different purposes. Often you'll hear people, when they're referring to something that favours one side over another, or seems to, in an election, they'll refer darkly to, oh, it's a gerrymander. But in fact, they're usually misusing the term. Gerrymander has a much more specific meaning. It means manipulating electoral boundaries by grouping voters for particular sides in such a way that one side is more likely to win seats than the other. Now, this is different from malapportionment, which is where some electorates have significantly fewer voters in them than others, so that the value of one person's vote in terms of the representation it achieves is greater than that of a person in a different electorate. In Australia, gerrymandering is not really a significant problem, although it has been in the past. And this is because now the electoral boundaries, both at the state and the federal level, are determined by independent commissioners through a fair process and according to set criteria. Malapportionment, however, remains an issue in Australia for two reasons. Because, first of all, Australia has a federal system, and secondly, because we have a very large geographical area with a sparsely and unevenly distributed population. So let's start with gerrymander and its origins. Well, the term was coined in response to a particular manipulation of electoral boundaries in the United States in the 19th century by a fellow called, who was the governor of Massachusetts, who was called Elbridge Gerry. Now, in the United States, it's the state legislatures that determine not only the boundaries of state electorates, but also the boundaries of congressional electorates for federal elections. And they do tend to manipulate them. So in 1812, Governor Gerry approved of what was called a redistricting bill, which manipulated the boundaries to such a degree that while one side won the most votes, it only won 11 out of 40 seats in the Senate, the state Senate of Massachusetts. Now, one of those districts was so weirdly shaped that it actually looked a bit like a salamander. So a newspaper decided to create a cartoon and call it a gerrymander after Governor Gerry. It's one of those things where the name actually stuck, and we still use it today for when an electoral boundary has been manipulated to favour a political party. So how does it work? Well, here's a simple illustration from Berkeley Political Review, and it shows that if 60% vote for party blue and 40% vote for party red, you can change the outcome of the election by how you draw the boundaries. If you draw them one way, then blue wins in all 5 districts. If you draw them in a different way, so as to concentrate the blue voters in some districts and spread the red voters around in 3 districts so that they can win a majority there, then blue only wins in 2 electorates, giving the overall victory to red, despite the fact that blue had the greater electoral support. Now, gerrymanders work because people who vote in a particular way do tend to congregate and live in particular areas. So, for example, rich people tend to live in some suburbs, poorer people tend to live in other suburbs. And also groups from particular ethnic backgrounds do tend to gather and live in the same areas. So while gerrymandering is predominantly used for partisan purposes, it can also be used to improve the chances of election of people from different ethnic backgrounds. Now, gerrymandering is a serious problem in the United States. While some studies have shown that at the federal level, the various partisan effects of different legislatures gerrymandering actually have the effect of largely cancelling out each other, it can have a very significant effect upon the state and the local level. What it does, however, is more important because it corrodes trust in democracy. It does this by undermining the legitimacy of elections, and it also makes it harder for representatives to be accountable if they are protected by gerrymandered boundaries and therefore don't need to respond to the concerns of their constituents. In Australia, electoral boundaries at the Commonwealth and the state level are drawn up by committees of officials rather than politicians. At the federal level, separate redistribution committees are established to determine the federal electorate boundaries in each of the states and territories. And they comprise of the Australian Electoral Commissioner, as well as the Senior Australian Electoral Officer for that relevant jurisdiction, so 2 Commonwealth officers, but also the Surveyor General and the Auditor General of that state or territory. So 2 state officials are included. And that's an extra protection against political stacking of the system because, of course, these state officials are not in any way controlled by the federal government. In making its redistribution, the committee must, according to statute, as far as practicable, ensure that the number of electors enrolled in each division in a state is no more than 103.5% and no less than 96.5% of the average divisional enrolment in the state at that time. In addition, they have to give consideration to what's called community of interest. So, for example, where people do their shopping, where they congregate, they go to meetings and concerts and go to school and all those sorts of things. They also have to consider the means of communication and travel within proposed electorates. So, for example, where the major roads are, where your public transport routes take you, those sorts of things. The physical features of an area, so if there's a river that divides people, those sorts of things, mountains, and also they have to consider the boundaries of the pre-existing electorate. So those are the things that they have to consider when deciding where to put the boundaries, not political advantage. Now, there's also extensive public consultation when an electoral redistribution is taking place. So political parties and members of the public can make submissions, they can criticise the submissions of others, they can make objections to proposed boundaries before the boundaries are finally settled. And the result is that electoral boundaries in Australia tend to be based on geography, the number of voters in an electorate, transport links, and consideration of where people naturally congregate. They do not reflect partisan manipulation. What we do have in Australia, however, is the malapportionment of electorates. And this is where some electorates have a much higher number of voters than others, so that the principle of one vote, one value does not accurately apply. In Australia, there are 3 reasons why this occurs. The first is the federal system. As part of the deal amongst the colonies that led to federation, there were a number of conditions, and they included equal representation of each of the states, or each original state, not if you come in later on, so each original state in the Senate, and also a minimum number of seats in the House of Representatives for each original state. That's 5. In addition to that, an electorate cannot cross state boundaries. Now, the consequence of this is that there is significant malapportionment in the Senate and also some in the House of Representatives. For example, at the 2022 half-Senate election, a senator required a quota of 685,818 votes to be elected in New South Wales, but you only needed 51,579 votes in order to be elected in Tasmania, and even less to be elected in the Northern Territory. There is a good reason for this malapportionment. It ensures that people from jurisdictions where there's a smaller population do have their voice adequately heard and cannot be, metaphorically, beaten into submission by the people in the larger states. And that was seen to be an important aspect of fairness in the federal system And it was indeed a condition of entering the federal system. Without it, federation would never have occurred. But one consequence is it does mean that this notion of one vote, one value does not apply in the Senate. The value of a person's vote in New South Wales in terms of the representation that it achieves is much, much lower than is the value of a vote in terms of representation from one of those other smaller jurisdictions. Representation of the territories in the Senate is not provided for in the Constitution, apart from the fact that it is allowed. It's actually done by legislation, the validity of which was held in a couple of controversial High Court decisions. Now, because the territories are not original states, they do not get the guarantee of an equal number of representatives in the Senate. So instead, at the moment, statute gives each of the ACT and the Northern Territory 2 senators each. Some in the ACT are campaigning for an additional Senate seat on the basis that the ACT has a higher quota at 95,073 than Tasmania and the Northern Territory. Well, that's true. But looking at the figures, you can see that its quota is so much lower than that of the other states that if this was the argument, it would actually increase malapportionment rather than reduce it. The number of electors in each House of Representatives electoral district is more equitable due to the statutory requirement that I told you before that's imposed on the redistribution commissioners about the leeway in terms of the population of electors in each one of those electorates. Now, the notable exception again is Tasmania, and that's because of that guarantee that it gets at least 5 seats. So it has significantly smaller numbers of electors in each of its 5 electorates. Another reason for malapportionment is geography and the capacity to represent people across a vast electorate. Because some very large parts of Australia do have a sparse population, the requirement for roughly equal numbers of electors in electorates can lead to absolutely massive electorates that have to be served by a single member of parliament. And this in turn raises questions about the quality of representation. Can an individual actually meet with their electors who have concerns when he or she is dealing with such a massive area of Australia? Due to developments in both communications and transport, this problem is not as acute today as it was at the beginning of the 20th century, when this actually was a very significant consideration in determining electoral boundaries. But this then takes us to the third reason for malapportionment, which of course is political manipulation. Voters in rural areas are more likely to vote for Conservative parties, while those in inner city electorates are more likely to vote for Labor or the Greens. Hence, there has been a long argument about whether the creation of electoral boundaries that favour smaller populations in the rural areas and larger populations in the inner cities is for the legitimate purpose of supporting quality representation in sparsely populated, vast geographical areas, or whether it's actually for partisan advantage. And that's where things get tricky in Australia. Now, there have been 2 High Court cases about this, about malapportionment. The first one occurred at the federal level in 1974 in a case called McKinley. Now, it was argued that the Constitution, by requiring Houses of Parliament to be directly chosen by the people, impliedly required that the number of electors in electorates be roughly equal. Now, a majority of the High Court, with Justice Murphy dissenting, rejected that argument. The majority did not think that the disparity in electorate numbers in this particular case was sufficient to give rise to unconstitutionality. But they did accept that electorates could become so grossly disproportionate that it would raise a question about whether the House of Representatives was directly chosen by the people. So there's an issue still out there, even though in that particular case, the High Court did not find that way. Now, in 1974 and 1988, the Australian people voted at referendums to constitutionalise this principle of one vote, one value, but each time it was rejected. In practice, however, the issue is now dealt with, but by legislation rather than the Constitution. And the legislation, as I mentioned before, sets out those quite precise parameters in terms of the population or the number of voters in relation to each particular electorate. Malapportionment has been more severe at the state level, and this was particularly so in Western Australia, where you also have the biggest problem of a large geographical area with sparsely populated electors. Now, at the 1993 election in Western Australia, some urban electorates had 26,000 voters in them, while some rural electorates only had 9,000. And in the Legislative Council, the difference was actually worse, ranging from 34,000 for an urban region to 9,100 for a rural region. Now, this was challenged in the High Court in the 1996 case of McGuinty. The High Court held that even if there was an implication of one vote, one value that you could draw from the Commonwealth Constitution based on the principle of representative democracy, it didn't actually extend to the states. The Commonwealth Constitution doesn't govern how state elections are held. And nor did the Western Australian Constitution itself require such an implication. Justice Dawson, in his judgment, also noted that there are worse things from a democratic point of view than malapportionment. And what did he point to? Gerrymander, of course. So he said gerrymander may occur regardless of malapportionment. He also observed that the problems of malapportionment would disappear if a system of proportional representation was used with a single state electorate, as indeed occurs, for example, in New South Wales. But he said that has problems itself. I mean, it encourages what he described as splinter groups. And he concluded that it is unwise to freeze into a constitutional requirement a particular aspect of an electoral system, the attraction of which might vary at different times. And so that's the general problem with, you can say something is absolutely constitutionally required now in these circumstances, and it may not be appropriate later on. His view was to leave it to the Parliament to decide. Of course, that means you have to trust the Parliament. Parliaments aren't necessarily trustworthy, so that can be problematic. Eventually, however, this malapportionment was addressed in Western Australia by legislation, first in 2005, where one vote, one value requirement was brought in for the lower house of the Western Australian Parliament and applied for elections from 2008 onwards. And the Western Australian upper house, which did prove to be more problematic, was eventually changed with a one vote, one value provision being included in 2021, which will operate for the first time at the 2025 election. In summary, partisan gerrymandering is a bad thing. It's a form of manipulation of elections so they do not represent the will of the people. Malapportionment may be justified in some cases. So, for example, in a federal system where you are particularly representing certain interests. And it may also be justified sometimes in terms of geographical issues. But in Australia, other forms of malapportionment have been progressively reduced or removed. Maybe we can trust our parliaments after all, who knows? Overall, Australia actually does rank well in avoiding both gerrymanders and malapportionment, and generally has an extremely fair system of elections, particularly when you compare it with the rest of the world. Elections are actually something that we do very well in Australia, and I think we should take time to celebrate and recognise that, rather than leaving the field open for all the people who are out there trying to undermine our electoral system and our democracy. Thank you for watching the Constitutional Clarion, and I hope you join me again next time. Goodbye.